Well, now that Canada, the U.S., and Mexico have signed the new NAFTA, or the CUSMA, as the Canadian government now calls it, many Canadians are wondering what happens next. The deal was signed at the G20 in Argentina on Friday, but as he left the summit this weekend, the U.S. president unveiled his strategy for getting the deal ratified in the U.S. Congress. He plans to announce in the coming days that he'll terminate the current NAFTA agreement, forcing Congress to ratify the new trade deal or have no three-way trade agreement at all. A risky strategy or smart bargaining? From Washington, I'm joined by Chris Sands, the director of the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Chris Sands, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me.
Nice to see you, Peter.
Why do you think Donald Trump's taking this all or nothing approach to getting this new trade deal ratified by the U.S. Congress?
Well, we've seen this behavior from the president before. He tends to not like being in a position of weakness and then tries to respond to that weakness by being even more aggressive. And in some ways, he is in a weak spot. Congress has to pass the agreement as implementing legislation, and it has to begin in the House because it's considered a money bill because it affects tariff rates. So Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, the new Democratic majority, as they come in the 116th Congress in January, has control over when implementation or, I guess, approval legislation begins. And there's not much the president can do to force her hand other than what he's trying now, threatening to cut the NAFTA agreement out of the picture so that Democrats will feel they need to rescue the economy and reestablish some framework for trade here in North America.
Right. The president's economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, told reporters today, look, President Trump's intent here is to light a fire under Congress. Is that what this is?
Yes, and I'm afraid it's only the beginning. In January, when the State of the Union address comes forward, I expect the president to make his case very forcefully. And I also expect him to begin suggesting that not passing this agreement weakens the U.S. position in regard to China. There's broad bipartisan support here in the United States for taking a tough line on China. There's a greater sense that China cheats than certainly than Canada does. And so the hope here is that by adding the argument that without this new trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, the U.S. will look weak and therefore be vulnerable to China, I think he's going to try to continue to increase the pressure on members of Congress to pass the agreement and let him move on to his next step. It is a lot of threatening and posturing, but it's not without potential to really move some Democrats.
Okay, let me drill down on that a little bit. Is this the kind of thing? Is this the kind of thing that Democrats will look at and say, okay, let's pay attention to what the president's saying here, in the logic you just explained for us about the connection to China, or do some Democrats have legitimate concerns about this new trade deal to the point that it could be threatened in the House?
I think the problem right now that Nancy Pelosi, as incoming Speaker of the House, has to contend with is that it's not clear how trade plays politically between Republicans and Democrats. That was our problem going into the U.S. midterms. Many Democrats have traditionally been more protectionist, closer to labor unions, and skeptical about this entire globalization project. And on the other hand, Republicans have tended to be more doctrinaire free traders. What's happened with Donald Trump is that many of those labor union blue-collar voters voted with him in 2016, and it's led Democrats to wonder whether they lost their claim to that part of the party. Many of the labor union voters so far have given the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement pretty positive reviews. So for traditional Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, there's not much to really fight the agreement on, except for the fact that Donald Trump is not popular with her base. But what's interesting is that many of the new progressive voices in the Democratic caucus were thinking about people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and even Beto O'Rourke, who was very successful in campaigning for Democrats in Texas, even though he didn't win his Senate race. These are people who don't necessarily share the old labor union view about trade. They're much more focused on globalization writ large. So it's not really clear where they will be willing to come down on this trade issue. I think if Nancy Pelosi had a choice, she wouldn't have this vote at all, but she's going to be forced to have it. And I think Donald Trump intends to see if he can't split the Democratic caucus and put her on the defensive with his rhetoric about canceling NAFTA and trade wars with China and so forth.
Let me finish on this with you. The Canadian side was pretty active, reaching around the Trump administration in Washington during the renegotiation of NAFTA. Is there a role for the Canadian side now in this next 6-month period if the president follows through on his plan to terminate NAFTA and then give this sort of ultimatum to the House of Representatives, to Congress, to get this deal passed? What, if anything, should the Canadian side be doing now? Does it continue to lobby? Does it step back and just let this go through the natural U.S. process?
It's a great question, Peter, because I think it goes to the heart of the dilemma now for Canada. Donald Trump, by threatening stability in our North American economy, by getting rid of NAFTA and so forth, is going to have a negative effect on the Canadian economy and the Mexican economy. The longer the uncertainty lasts, the worse it is for business in our neighboring trade partner countries. And in that environment, he's going to try to get Mexico and Canada to lobby on behalf of passage of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement by the Congress. And frankly, many Democrats are more sympathetic to hearing from Canada and Mexico than they are from hearing from the White House. So rather than ask Canada for help to get this through, he's going to try to create a situation in which Canada, in its own national interest, is forced to make phone calls, to talk to governors, to talk to senators and members of the House in favor of an agreement that most Canadians are somewhat lukewarm about, just because stability at the end of the day is so important for the Canadian economy. It's the work of a very strategic, if not bully boy type administration, I'm sorry to say.
All right, Chris Sands, always good to get your perspective. Thanks for it again tonight, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you very much, Peter.